It was the dog they all feared. Everyone called him a monster. Trainers gave up. Volunteers kept their distance. He'd bite, bark, and lunge at anyone who came near. No one dared get close until one little girl ignored all the warnings and walked straight up to the snarling German Shepherd. That aggressive dog did something no one expected, leaving the entire shelter shocked. The shelter was quiet, eerily quiet. Most of the dogs were sleeping, a low hum of occasional whimpers and distant barks echoing down the hallway. But not in Kennel 9. That cage was different. A warning sign bolted to the door. In bold red letters read, "Aggressive, do not approach," and everyone obeyed it. Inside sat a massive German Shepherd with cold, unblinking eyes. His coat was thick and dark, with a few patches of thinning fur that hinted at years of rough treatment. His ears twitched at every sound, his muscles coiled like a loaded spring. The staff called him Shadow, not for his color, but for how he moved, silent, quick, and unpredictable. No one touched him, no one dared. Shadow had bitten 3 handlers in just 2 months. One required stitches, the others quit. Even seasoned trainers refused to enter his cage. They called him feral, untamable, a product of violence that couldn't be reversed. He snarled at anyone who approached, lunged at fences, and shredded anything tossed into his space. Rachel, the shelter director, stood at a distance, arms crossed, watching him through the bars. She'd seen dozens of difficult dogs in her career, neglected, abused, traumatized, but none quite like this. Shadow was different. He didn't bark to be noticed. He didn't whine for food or attention. He just stared, calculating, patient, like he was waiting for something. Or someone. She sighed, glancing at the paperwork in her hand. Final review, 14 days left, it read. If no one stepped in, if no miracle happened, Shadow would be euthanized. It was standard policy for aggressive dogs considered a danger to the public. Still, it felt wrong. Rachel didn't believe in giving up. Not easily, not yet. The last trainer they brought in was a combat veteran with experience in military K-9 units. Even he gave up after a week. "This one's too far gone," he'd said, showing Rachel the tear marks on his sleeve. "It's like he doesn't want help. He's made peace with being alone. That's dangerous." But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow's violence wasn't senseless. It was controlled, intentional. There was a pain in his eyes, a flicker of something buried deep beneath the aggression. Maybe fear, maybe memory. Whatever it was, it haunted her. She watched him now as a volunteer nervously placed a bowl of food through a long metal slot. Shadow didn't move, didn't even blink. He waited until the door closed again and the footsteps retreated down the hall. Only then did he inch forward, sniff the bowl, and eat slowly, like a soldier trained never to let his guard down. Even while eating, a nearby volunteer whispered to another, "Why don't they just put him down already? He scares the whole building." Rachel heard it. She didn't respond, but her jaw tightened. She hated when people gave up on animals like they were broken furniture. But she also knew she was running out of time. Later that night, after the shelter closed, Rachel walked the halls alone, turning off lights and checking locks. When she passed Shadow's cage, she stopped. The dog was awake, staring straight at her through the darkness. They held eye contact for a long time. Neither moved, neither blinked. Then, in the silence, something odd happened. Shadow let out a low, almost imperceptible whine. Not aggressive, not threatening, just empty. Rachel's brows furrowed. It was the first sound he'd made in days. Something inside her shifted. "Who hurt you?" she whispered, almost to herself. Shadow didn't move, but for a moment, his ears twitched toward her voice. It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in the wall. Rachel stepped back. She didn't smile, didn't speak again. But as she locked the shelter door behind her that night, one thought lingered in her mind. Maybe the monster in the cage wasn't a monster after all. Maybe he was just waiting for the right person to see it. Rachel sat at her desk, the early morning sun casting soft rays across scattered paperwork. Coffee steamed beside her, untouched and cooling. On her screen blinked an email from the board. Final update required on subject number 274, resolution by end of month. Subject number 274. That was Shadow. And they wanted answers. She leaned back, exhaling slowly. The shelter had seen hard cases before. Abandoned dogs, trauma survivors, fighting ring rescues. But Shadow was something else. He hadn't just lost trust, he'd buried it so deep no one could find it. And now, they wanted to close his file. For good. The staff was divided. Some were fearful, others angry. "We can't keep him here forever," one trainer said last week. "He's scaring the new volunteers." Another chimed in. "We could use his kennel for 3 safer dogs." Cold, maybe, but practical. Resources were always stretched. One violent dog could tip the whole system. Rachel got up and walked to the observation window overlooking the kennels. Shadow lay motionless, his head resting on his front paws, eyes open. Alert, as always. Waiting for a threat. Or worse, expecting it. She rubbed her temple, torn between logic and instinct. Was it wrong to keep hoping for a breakthrough? Her mind wandered back to the first time she saw him. He'd arrived muzzled, chained, and sedated. His paperwork was thin, discharged from a failed government program, deemed unsuitable for further service. Uncontrollable, it read. No owner, no records, just a whisper from the transporter. Don't get close. But Rachel had built this shelter on second chances. The entire facility stood on that belief. And this felt like its biggest test yet. If she let Shadow go, did it mean she'd failed her own mission? She called a staff meeting that afternoon, determined to find a path forward. Everyone gathered in the break room, trainers, vets, volunteers. Some stood with arms folded, already skeptical. Others leaned in, hopeful she had a plan. "I won't lie," Rachel began. "We're at the end of the line with Shadow. If we can't show progress soon, the board will shut this down." Murmurs rippled through the room. "So, I need ideas. Fresh ones. Anything we haven't tried." A hand raised. Marcus, a young vet tech, spoke hesitantly. What if we stop trying to control him? Maybe we're pushing too hard. Maybe he needs space, not commands." Another trainer laughed dryly. "Or maybe he needs a miracle." Rachel nodded slowly. "What he needs is someone who can reach him without fear. Someone who sees more than the aggression." Silence followed. The truth hung heavy in the air. No such person existed. Not yet. As the room cleared, Rachel lingered. Her thoughts circled back to the idea Marcus raised. Maybe they had been approaching Shadow all wrong. Maybe force wasn't the key. Maybe connection was. But who could offer that? In a way that Shadow wouldn't reject. That night, she reviewed footage from the security cameras. Most showed the same pattern: Shadow pacing, growling, attacking anything placed too close. But one clip stood out. It was a brief moment from the night before, when she'd whispered to him. She paused the video. There. His ears twitched. It was real. A spark ignited in her chest. Small, but enough. Shadow had responded. Barely, but enough to matter. Maybe he wasn't unreachable. Maybe he just hadn't met the right soul yet. Someone who didn't bring commands or fear, but something gentler. She scribbled notes in her journal, her mind racing. No trainers, no tests, no dominance. Just presence, softness, patience. It sounded foolish, too idealistic. But Shadow had already defied every conventional method. Maybe it was time to try something completely different. She didn't know it then, but the answer would arrive sooner than she imagined, and in the form of someone no one expected. Not a handler, not a therapist, but a child. And that child would change everything. The file was thinner than Rachel expected. A few photocopied pages, some heavily redacted, others creased and faded. Shadow's past was mostly a mystery. No official birth records, no known breeder, no former owner listed. But one thing was clear. His life hadn't started with love. It had started with orders. At the top of the file, in bold capital letters, it read, Military Unit K9, classified. A training stamp confirmed he'd been enlisted in a high-risk K9 program, the kind used for tactical combat, search and detain, and field operations. He had been property, not a pet, and like many others, discarded when he couldn't perform anymore. Rachel flipped to a behavioral report from nearly 2 years back. Excessively reactive, displays heightened aggression when confined, shows refusal to submit, deemed unsuitable for team integration. Then, scribbled in a different pen at the bottom, possibly salvageable, shows flashes of control around female voice tones. That last line caught her attention. She underlined it. Was that a clue, something buried in his wiring that responded to gentleness? Perhaps a hint that his aggression wasn't random, but selective, tied to trauma? She turned to the next page, which contained grainy photos. One showed Shadow in a military harness, standing beside a man whose face was blurred. Another photo showed a younger Shadow, mid-training, leaping through fire. He looked powerful, fearless. But even then, his eyes. They weren't playful. They weren't curious. They were watchful, guarded. According to the report, something happened during his last mission. No specifics, just a vague sentence. Incident during live operation. Handler incapacitated. No further details. No injuries logged on Shadow. But after that, his record stopped. He vanished from the system for over a year before being found wandering near a truck stop, half-starved, injured, and aggressive. A rescue team had tried to secure him with a catch pole. Shadow had broken the handle. 2 men suffered bites. And so, like so many other problem dogs, he was tossed into the system, bounced from one failed rehoming attempt to the next, until he finally ended up at Rachel's facility. She leaned back in her chair, absorbing it all. His aggression wasn't born in the shelter, it was born in betrayal, in pain, in being used as a tool and discarded when he no longer served a purpose. And now he was expected to forget all that? To simply behave like a house pet? She stared at the last page in the file. It was a veterinary scan, a skeletal image. At first, it seemed normal until she noticed the faint outline of healed fractures. Multiple. Ribs, back leg. Possibly from kicks. Or worse. Rachel's stomach tightened. Someone had hurt him, badly, repeatedly. And yet, he'd survived. She closed the file and rested her hand over it. There was more to this dog than rage. There was a story no one had listened to. A history written not in words but in wounds, both visible and invisible. Rachel walked out of her office and stood before his kennel again. Shadow lifted his head. Their eyes met. And for the first time, she whispered. Not instructions, not a command, but something softer. I know you're not bad. I know they did something to you. Shadow didn't move, but he blinked, slowly. Rachel didn't smile, but she felt something shift. Not in him, yet, but in herself. Her mission was no longer about just preventing euthanasia. It was about redemption. And she'd be damned if she didn't give him every last chance to find it. She turned away and locked his file in her drawer. Whatever Shadow had been through, however deep the scars ran, he still deserved one thing nobody had ever given him: a chance to be loved. The hallway leading to Kennel 9 had become a no-go zone. Volunteers took long detours to avoid it. Trainers left his feeding to interns or new hires until they learned the hard way. And even the janitor, an ex-Marine with nerves of steel, made sure his mop never crossed Shadow's threshold. Shadow had made sure of it. He ruled that corner of the shelter like a ghost, silent, intense, unpredictable. The only sounds from his kennel were the occasional low growl or the crash of a chewed-up metal bowl slammed against the bars. His presence alone was enough to chill the air. Twice a day, staff delivered food through a steel chute bolted into the lower part of the gate. No human hand ever got closer than that. Water bowls were placed on long-arm trays. Bedding was rarely changed, because the last person who tried still had the scar on her forearm. Rachel watched it all with growing unease. Not because Shadow scared her, but because he was retreating further into himself. Every time someone refused to meet his eyes or avoided his space, the walls around him grew higher. He wasn't just aggressive, he was disappearing. One morning, a new volunteer named Jen approached Rachel nervously. "Is it true he bit 3 people?" she asked, holding a stack of leashes. Rachel hesitated. "Yes, but only after they tried to dominate him. You can't meet trauma with force." Jen gave a skeptical smile. "Then how do you meet it?" Rachel didn't have an answer, not yet. Later that afternoon, a trainer named Kyle attempted something bold. Armed with protective gear and years of dog handling experience, he decided to face Shadow head-on. "Let me in with him," he insisted. "I want to test his threshold." Rachel was hesitant. You know what happened last time? Kyle nodded. I won't push him. I just want to see if there's a line. They suited him up in padded sleeves and bite guards. A tranquilizer dart was prepared, just in case. Cameras rolled from the corners of the kennel. Rachel watched from the observation room, her chest tight. The door opened slowly. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He simply stood up and stared. Kyle stepped inside, cautiously. Easy, boy, he said softly. I'm not here to hurt you. Shadow didn't move, but his body tensed like a coiled spring. Kyle held out his gloved hand. Let's be friends, huh? A low growl started from Shadow's chest. Deep. Warning. Kyle took another step. Shadow snapped. He launched with terrifying precision, jaws clamping onto the padded sleeve with force that rattled the metal door. Kyle staggered back, eyes wide. Back out! Rachel yelled into the comm. Now! The staff dragged Kyle out just in time. Shadow didn't chase. He returned to his corner, panting but calm, as if he'd made his point. Later, Kyle admitted, that dog wasn't just defending territory. He was defending himself from memory. That wasn't attack. That was survival. No one volunteered to enter his kennel again. Rachel walked past the cage that night, pausing like she always did. Shadow sat in the farthest corner, head low, eyes dim. He didn't growl. He didn't even look up. She crouched outside the bars, her voice barely above a whisper. Why won't you let us in? Silence. Then, a blink. It wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing either. Rachel sat there for a few more minutes, just breathing. No talking, no movement, just presence. And for the first time in days, Shadow didn't retreat to the shadows. He stayed in the light. Maybe, just maybe, the door to his cage wasn't the only one that needed opening. It was a Friday afternoon when Lily arrived, unexpected, uninvited, and entirely out of place in a building full of barking dogs and stressed out adults. She was 6, small for her age, with 2 messy braids and a sparkly backpack covered in cartoon cats. Her sneakers lit up with every step. Rachel had forgotten her sister was dropping Lily off early that day. Just for an hour, her sister had said. Preschool's closed and I'm stuck in traffic. Rachel had no choice. The office was quiet, and Lily promised to sit quietly with her coloring books. It seemed harmless enough. But children don't stay put for long, especially curious ones. While Rachel stepped into a meeting with the shelter vet, Lily grew bored. She wandered out of the office unnoticed, past the rows of kennels and toward the sounds that frightened most people. Her eyes were wide, soaking in every wagging tail and sleepy yawn, until she reached the one door no one ever opened. Kennel 9. The sign didn't mean anything to her. Red letters didn't scare her. She peeked through the bars and saw him, Shadow, sitting in the corner like a statue. He didn't bark, didn't move, just stared at the little girl standing before him. Lily tilted her head. Hi, puppy, she whispered. Shadow didn't respond. His ears twitched. She took a step closer to the gate. Why are you all alone? Still nothing, but the usual growl, the warning everyone feared, never came. Instead, Shadow rose slowly, approached the bars, and sat down, eye level with her, watching, waiting. Lily crouched. You look sad. From the control room, one of the interns caught movement on the surveillance camera and panicked. Oh my God, is that a kid in front of Shadow's cage? He shouted, bolting from his chair. Alarm sounded inside Rachel's head when she heard the words. She sprinted from the exam room, heart hammering. Lily! She screamed, racing down the hall. Staff ran behind her, expecting the worst, expecting blood. But what they found froze them in their tracks. Lily was sitting cross-legged in front of the bars, her hand resting against the cage. Shadow sat just inches away, unmoving, unthreatening. His ears were up. His tail wasn't wagging, but it wasn't stiff either. And his eyes? They weren't cold. Rachel didn't know whether to yell or cry. Lily, she called softly. Sweetheart, come here. The little girl turned, startled. This dog's not mean, she said simply. He's just lonely. Shadow didn't move as Rachel slowly stepped forward and scooped Lily into her arms. You can't come in here, baby. He's not safe. Lily looked back at the dog. He didn't hurt me. Rachel didn't know how to respond, because she was right. Shadow hadn't growled, hadn't lunged. He had just watched her, quietly, like she mattered. That night, after Lily had gone home and the shelter quieted, Rachel replayed the surveillance footage over and over again. The way Shadow approached Lily, the stillness in his body, the absence of rage. It wasn't an accident. He had chosen not to strike, and Lily, without even knowing, had crossed into a space no adult could, without fear, without ego, just kindness, just presence. Rachel closed her laptop and whispered to the empty room, "Why her?" Outside, in Kennel 9, Shadow paced in slow circles, then lay down at the front of the gate for the first time, as if he was waiting for her to come back. The next morning, Lily was already waiting outside Rachel's office, holding a crumpled drawing in one hand and a juice box in the other. "Can I see him again?" she asked brightly, like she was talking about a friend, not a dog known for violent outbursts and shattered trust. Rachel hesitated. The image of Lily sitting in front of Shadow still haunted her, in equal parts terror and awe. "Sweetheart, he's not like the other dogs," she said carefully. "He's been hurt. He's scared." Lily nodded, eyes serious. "I think he's just waiting for someone to be kind." That line, simple, soft, and impossibly wise, stuck in Rachel's chest like a hook. She thought of all the trainers who barked orders at Shadow, all the handlers who demanded obedience, the shelter staff who approached with fear instead of empathy. And now, here was a child, gentle, innocent, unafraid, cutting through walls no adult had ever breached. Rachel made a decision, a cautious one. "Okay," she said slowly, "but we do it my way. You stay behind the gate, no reaching through, and I stay with you the whole time." Lily beamed and skipped ahead, clutching her drawing, a picture of a big black dog with a sad face and a tiny girl holding out a heart. The shelter was quiet as they approached Kennel 9. Rachel's heart pounded. Shadow lay curled near the back, alert as always, but still. His eyes snapped open when he heard the soft patter of Lily's shoes. But this time, he didn't rise. He didn't growl, he waited. Lily crouched just outside the bars and held up her drawing. "I made this for you," she said. "It's us." Shadow tilted his head. His gaze flicked from the paper to the girl, then back again. Rachel watched, breath held. Any moment, she expected a snap, a growl, a retreat. But instead, Shadow stood and padded slowly to the front of the kennel, not threatening, not timid, just curious. He sat down directly in front of Lily, eyes locked on her. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. "Hi," she whispered. "I missed you." Shadow's ears twitched, and then, impossibly, he lowered his head, slowly, carefully, until his nose rested just inches from the bars. Rachel stared in disbelief. This dog, this so-called monster, was placing himself in a position of vulnerability. Not dominance, not defense, submission, voluntary, earned. Lily gently slid her drawing under the kennel gate. "It's okay," she said. "You can have it." Shadow sniffed the paper, then let out a low, slow huff. Not a warning. A sigh. He laid down completely, eyes never leaving Lily. The room behind them had gone still. A few staff members stood frozen, watching through the windows. Phones were raised, recording, but no one made a sound. Lily giggled. "He likes it," she said. "See?" Rachel's eyes burned. She had no words. Then, Shadow did something that left everyone speechless. He pressed his paw against the bars, softly, deliberately, until it touched the edge of Lily's shoe. She placed her tiny hand on the other side of the gate, palm against paw. A silent connection, no commands, no leashes, just trust. Fragile, impossible, real. Rachel knelt beside her, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You did something none of us could," she whispered. Lily smiled. He just needed someone not to be scared of him. For the first time in months, Shadow's tail moved. Not much. Just a slight thump against the concrete, but it was enough to break everyone watching. He wasn't just reacting, he was reaching back. After that first breakthrough, Rachel couldn't ignore what had happened. It wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. Shadow, the dog labeled too dangerous to touch, had voluntarily reached out to a child, and not in defense or fear, but in connection. A door had opened, and Rachel wasn't about to shut it. She made a decision that startled the entire staff. Lily would be allowed to visit Shadow under strict supervision, 30 minutes a day, always with Rachel present, no touching beyond the kennel bars. It wasn't protocol, but then again, Shadow had never followed protocol either. The next day, Lily arrived with purpose. She carried a plastic tote filled with crayons, construction paper, and string. "I'm making him a picture book," she announced proudly, "so he knows I'll come back every day." She set up her art camp right outside Kennel 9 and got to work. Shadow, already at the front of the cage, watched every movement. His eyes followed the crayons in Lily's hands. He huffed occasionally, not out of frustration, but interest. When she spoke, he listened. When she laughed, his ears perked. Slowly, his posture changed. Less tension, more alertness. Still guarded, but not hostile. By the fourth visit, something subtle happened. When Lily walked in, Shadow wagged his tail. Just once. Just a few slow, heavy thumps against the concrete. Rachel saw it. So did the volunteers. It was the shelter's first visible sign that Shadow wasn't just tolerating the girl. He was waiting for her, expecting her, needing her. Lily's routine never changed. She arrived every morning, placed her drawings beside the kennel, and told Shadow stories. Not complicated ones, just the kind only a child could come up with. Stories about flying dogs, magical parks, and ice cream made of clouds. Shadow never barked, never growled. He simply listened. Rachel began documenting it all. Video clips, journal notes, behavior logs. She shared it with the board, the vet, even the original military contact who had once handled Shadow's file. No one could explain it. No trainer had gotten that far. No medication had ever helped him this much. But this little girl was doing the impossible. On the 7th day, Lily brought something new. "I brought him my scarf," she said, holding up a soft purple fleece. "It smells like me, so he doesn't forget." Rachel hesitated, unsure if it was a good idea. But Lily slid it carefully under the gate. Shadow didn't tear it apart. He sniffed it, then gently pulled it into his corner and curled around it like it was something precious. Rachel stared through the glass, her heart full. This wasn't just progress, it was transformation. Other dogs barked in the distance, but Shadow stayed calm. Loud noises still made him twitch. Fast movements still made him flinch. But Lily? She was his anchor. The only constant in a world that had always failed him. By the end of the 2nd week, Rachel noticed another change. Shadow no longer retreated to the back of the cage at night. Instead, he slept near the front gate, beside Lily's drawings, curled against her scarf. Sometimes, when the shelter lights dimmed, he let out soft, rhythmic whines, not painful, not panicked, almost mournful. He was beginning to feel again. And somehow, this child with no training, no experience, no plan, had become his light. Rachel sat in her office one evening, reviewing the footage. On the screen, Lily was leaning against the kennel, softly humming. Shadow lay just inches away, his eyes half closed, completely at ease. The once feral dog had found peace in the voice of a child. And in those daily visits, a bond was being woven, delicate, invisible, but stronger than steel. It was the 12th day of Lily's visits when it happened. The day started like the others, quiet, uneventful, filled with scribbled drawings and made-up songs. But something in the air felt different. Shadow had been waiting by the gate before Lily even arrived, eyes focused, tail gently tapping the floor in anticipation. Rachel walked in beside her, clipboard in hand, her nerves sharper than usual. Every visit still carried risk. Shadow was powerful, unpredictable in his past, and even with the progress they'd made, the shelter board was watching closely. One wrong move, and this fragile miracle could collapse. Lily knelt beside the gate and pulled a small Ziploc bag from her backpack. "I brought him a treat today," she said with excitement. Inside was a single soft biscuit shaped like a bone. "I made it with peanut butter and honey. Mom helped." Rachel knelt beside her. "Honey, maybe we just let him sniff it first, okay?" But before Lily could even place it down, Shadow was already crouching low, nose twitching, ears forward, not aggressive, not demanding, just alert. He pressed his snout against the bars, waiting, quietly, respectfully. Lily slid the treat gently through the narrow slot at the bottom of the cage. Shadow sniffed once, then again, and then he ate it. Not violently, not in defense, but calmly, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. "He likes it," Lily beamed. "He ate it." And then Shadow did the unthinkable. He sat up, moved closer, and pressed his head against the bars, directly where Lily's hand rested. Not a nudge, not a snap. A lean, slow, intentional. Rachel grabbed Lily's hand instinctively, pulling it back. But Shadow didn't flinch. He stayed there, waiting. Lily looked up at her aunt. "Can I pet him?" Rachel's instinct screamed no. The risk, the pressure, the headlines if something went wrong, but the moment held stillness, a quiet sacredness. And in Shadow's body language, Rachel saw something she hadn't seen in any video, any report, any behavioral file. Trust. She nodded once. Just 2 fingers, very gentle, through the bars, and I'm right here. Lily reached forward, barely brushing the top of his head. Shadow didn't growl. He didn't twitch. He leaned in harder. That single touch, soft as a whisper, was all it took. Years of trauma, of fear, of rejection seemed to melt in an instant. Rachel had seen 1,000 rehabilitations, but none like this. None this pure. From behind the glass, other staff members watched in silent awe. Someone began to cry. Another whispered, "That can't be the same dog." Rachel placed her hand on Lily's shoulder, steadying her, but also steadying herself. Emotion trembled in her chest. "You're doing something no one else could," she whispered. Lily smiled. "I told you, he's not mean, he's just sad." Later that day, Rachel entered a final note in Shadow's file. First physical touch. 0 aggression, full submission, breakthrough confirmed. She attached the surveillance footage and sent it to the shelter board. And then, for the first time since Shadow's arrival, she ticked a box in his file that had remained blank for months. Adoptability. Under evaluation. That night, as the shelter lights dimmed and silence settled across the kennels, Rachel passed by Shadow's cage one last time. He was curled up at the gate, Lily's scarf still beside him, the scent of peanut butter lingering in the air. He raised his head when he saw Rachel. For a split second, his eyes softened. Not in defense, but in hope. By the end of the second week, Shadow's transformation was no longer a secret. Word had spread through the shelter and then beyond. A once aggressive military dog, unreachable, untouchable, was now lying quietly for a 6-year-old girl's gentle hand. Staff whispered in hallways, volunteers began requesting to observe the sessions, and emails from the shelter board arrived more frequently. Everyone wanted to know, what's happening in Kennel 9? Rachel had documented every interaction, every tail wag, every sigh, every time Shadow leaned in rather than backed away. The evidence was clear to her. Progress was happening, healing was underway. But not everyone saw it that way. In the staff meeting on Monday morning, tensions surfaced. "I don't like it," said Kyle, the senior trainer who had once tried and failed to enter Shadow's cage. "It's a liability. We're letting a child near a dog with a violent history. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen." "He hasn't shown a single sign of aggression toward her," Rachel countered calmly. "Not once." "That doesn't mean he won't," Kyle snapped. "All it takes is one trigger, one loud noise, one wrong move." Another staff member, Jen, nodded. "What if something happens when you're not there? Kids are unpredictable, so are dogs like him." Rachel folded her arms. "That's why I am there, every second. And Lily isn't unpredictable. She's consistent, calm, and patient. Frankly, she's doing more for his recovery than any of us ever could." "But that's the problem," Kyle said. "She's not trained. None of this is by the book." Rachel met his eyes. Maybe the book doesn't work for dogs like him. Silence fell. No one had a rebuttal. Still, whispers continued. An anonymous letter arrived on Rachel's desk. "If something happens to that child, it's on you." She read it twice before tearing it in half. Later that day, an inspector from the board arrived unannounced, middle-aged, suited, clipboard in hand. He asked for Shadow's behavioral logs, sat in on a session from behind the glass, and interviewed staff. Rachel could feel the judgment radiating from him, masked behind polite nods. After watching Lily place another drawing through the gate and Shadow curl up beside it, he turned to Rachel. "You're risking a child's safety for a publicity stunt." Rachel's jaw tightened. "Number." I'm giving a damaged soul the only thing that's ever reached him. Love. He scribbled something on his paper. If there's an incident, this facility will be liable. Be very careful, Ms. Lane. That night, Rachel sat in her office long after the shelter closed. The weight of every voice, every warning pressed against her. She stared at the footage of Lily humming beside Shadow's cage. He was calm, gentle, listening, and yet they still saw danger. They didn't see what she saw, a bond forming in silence, a shattered spirit choosing to trust again, a beast slowly becoming something else, something softer. She rubbed her temples and sighed. Was she wrong? Was this too much to risk? The next morning, she nearly canceled Lily's visit. But when Lily walked in, scarf tied around her neck, a picture book in hand, Shadow perked up. His entire body lifted, his tail thumped. And in that instant, Rachel knew. Whatever anyone else thought, this was real. Opposition could grow, critics could shout, but the truth sat right there in Kennel 9. One broken dog, one fearless girl, and a kind of trust no expert had ever been able to build. Rachel wouldn't take that away. Not now, not ever. It began as a simple question, one that Lily asked without fear, without agenda. "Why can't I go in with him?" she said, swinging her legs from the bench outside Kennel 9. Her eyes were wide, curious. "He won't hurt me." Rachel froze. The question wasn't new. Lily had asked it before, quietly, softly. But this time, it felt different. This time, Shadow was at the front of the cage, ears up, tail resting gently on the floor. His eyes followed the girl with quiet calm. "Because it's not safe," Rachel said, almost automatically. But even as the words left her mouth, doubt stirred inside. Was that still true? For days now, Shadow had shown no signs of aggression, no growls, no lunges. He responded to Lily's voice like it was a lighthouse in the dark. He hadn't so much as flinched around her, not when she dropped her crayons, not when she giggled too loudly, not even when she sneezed suddenly beside the bars. Still, Rachel had rules, and rules kept everyone safe. But that afternoon, something shifted. Lily knelt near the gate and pressed her forehead softly to the bars. "I think he misses hugs," she whispered. Shadow, lying just inches away, let out a quiet whine. Rachel's heart caught in her throat. The following morning, she gathered her senior staff for a private discussion. Not everyone agreed. Some outright refused. But Marcus, the vet tech, said what Rachel had been thinking all along. Every sign points to progress. If we never test that boundary, we'll never know how far he's come. It wasn't a casual decision. Protocols were reviewed. Emergency protocols were discussed. A team would stand by, out of sight but within reach. Rachel would be inside the kennel first. If Shadow remained calm, and only if everything stayed perfectly controlled, Lily would step in, just a few feet. Nothing more. It was risky. But it was time. That afternoon, the shelter went still. Cameras were set. Staff held their breath. Rachel approached Kennel 9, keycard trembling in her hand. Shadow stood up as she unlocked the gate, tail neutral, head slightly lowered. Not aggressive, attentive. She stepped in slowly. Shadow didn't move. Rachel knelt, hand open at her side, not reaching. Just present. He sniffed her gently, then lay back down. Calm. Focused. She looked toward the door. "Bring her in," she said. Lily entered the room, holding her drawing pad tight to her chest. Her steps were small, but sure. Rachel stood beside her as she eased into the kennel, only a few feet in. Shadow watched, no growl, no tension. Just a long, deep breath. Lily sat on the floor. "Hi again," she whispered. "I missed you." And then, the moment no one expected. Shadow rose and approached, slowly, gently. His nose brushed against her knee. Lily reached up and placed her hand on his head. He didn't just allow it. He leaned into it. Gasps filled the observation room. Rachel felt her knees weaken. Lily giggled. "Told you, he just needed a friend." Shadow curled beside her, his head resting on her lap. Rachel knelt behind them, tears in her eyes. "He's never done that, not even once." Lily looked up. "He knows I'm not scary." Outside the cage, the staff stood stunned. Months of fear, training, and doubt, undone by a child's quiet heart. It wasn't dominance that had opened this door. It was trust. For the first time since arriving at the shelter, Shadow had let someone in, literally and emotionally. And the cage, once built to keep him away from the world, was no longer holding back a monster. It was holding a miracle. The day after Lily stepped into the cage, everything changed. Shadow was no longer pacing the corners of his kennel like a ghost trapped in a loop. He waited calmly by the door each morning, ears perked not in alarm, but in hope. The staff who once avoided his section now paused outside the glass, peeking in with cautious curiosity. The monster in the cage was becoming something else, someone else. Lily continued her visits, now from inside the enclosure under careful supervision. Rachel never left her side, but she found herself stepping back more often, letting the bond unfold naturally. Shadow responded to Lily's voice like it was a command he had always understood. Sit, stay, lie down. He followed her soft-spoken requests not out of fear, but willingness. The shift was unmistakable. Even the trainers noticed. "He's not reacting to tone," Marcus observed during a session. "He's reacting to connection." Rachel nodded. She doesn't give him orders, she gives him trust. They began integrating gentle exercises, basic obedience, small movements, desensitization drills. No harsh voices, no clickers, no treats. Just Lily's voice, her drawings, and an occasional scratch behind the ears. Shadow adapted quickly, too quickly. A dog that had once required 3 men and a sedative to enter a transport crate now followed Lily into one willingly, just because she asked. He no longer growled when leashes were shown. He didn't flinch when hands neared his head. Even the sight of gloves, which used to send him into a frenzy, no longer triggered a response. "He's rewiring," Rachel whispered to herself one day, watching Shadow rest his head on Lily's legs. Not because of us, but because of her. Outside the kennel, change was happening too. The staff began speaking differently about him. Volunteers, once afraid to walk past his gate, now left folded blankets and toys nearby. A few even whispered good morning when they passed. It was subtle, but respect was returning to his name. One afternoon, during a rainy visit, Lily sat beside Shadow with a storybook in her lap. She read out loud, slow and stumbling, her voice filled with innocence. "And the dog who had no home found a little girl who gave him one, not with walls, but with love." Shadow rested his chin across her feet and sighed. A sound of peace. Rachel caught it on video. She posted a short clip online with the caption, "Aggressive K9, who trusted no one, now falls asleep to a child's voice." Within hours, it went viral, but Rachel didn't care about the likes. She cared about the progress. Shadow's behavior continued to improve. During one training session, Kyle, the very same trainer who once feared him, entered the kennel slowly, hands visible. Shadow stood, tail steady, and sat on command. Kyle offered a hand, bare this time. Shadow sniffed, then licked his palm. Kyle looked at Rachel, stunned. "He remembers me," he said, "but he's forgiven me." That was the moment Rachel knew. Shadow wasn't just recovering, he was choosing forgiveness, and that, more than any command or cue, was the clearest sign of all. The walls were coming down, brick by brick, growl by growl, wound by wound, and the dog who once snarled at kindness now leaned into it with his whole body. Rachel stared at him that night through the observation window, her hand pressed to the glass. "You're coming back to us," she whispered, and inside the kennel, curled beside a sleeping child with a storybook draped over his paw, Shadow finally looked at peace. Not as a weapon, not as a warning, but as a soul rediscovered. The rain came fast that morning, thick, angry sheets pounding the shelter roof as thunder cracked overhead. The power flickered twice before going out entirely. Emergency lights hummed to life, casting red glows down the dim hallways. Rachel's radio crackled with static. Something wasn't right. She was halfway to the generator room when the alarm sounded. A door had been forced open. "Someone's inside!" Marcus's voice shouted from down the corridor. "Back entrance, breach!" Rachel's heart dropped. They rarely had break-ins, but this storm made the shelter vulnerable. She turned on her flashlight and ran, boots splashing through shallow puddles forming in the hallway. Then she heard it. A loud clang, metal crashing against tile. kennels being opened. Panic rose in her throat. "Check the cages," she ordered. "All of them." Volunteers and staff scrambled, counting heads, closing gates, herding panicked dogs back into place. Most of the animals had stayed in their enclosures, frightened by the noise. But as Rachel rounded the final corner, she saw the one thing she feared most. Kennel 9's gate was wide open. Shadow was gone. Rachel's blood turned cold. She raced toward the exit, yelling, "Lock down the east wing! Secure the doors!" Shadow was a 100-pound ex-military shepherd with a history of aggression. If he panicked or felt cornered, someone could get hurt, or worse. A crash echoed down the hallway. Rachel spun toward the sound and found chaos. 2 volunteers had been caught near the back kennels. One was on the floor, shielding another dog. The other stood frozen, wide-eyed, and there was Shadow, standing at the center of it all. Not attacking, not growling, just watching, tense, alert. His body in that perfect stillness that came before a decision. Rachel stepped forward slowly. "Shadow," she whispered. "It's me." He turned his head, eyes locking onto her. For a brief moment, she saw something flicker behind them, uncertainty. A piece of his old self, triggered by the storm and confusion. Then behind her, another sound, soft footsteps. Lily. She had slipped through the staff hallway, drawn by the commotion. Her raincoat dripped, hair soaked, eyes wide with concern. "Shadow," she called gently. Rachel froze. "No, Lily, wait." But it was too late. Shadow turned toward the sound of her voice, and his entire body changed. The tension melted. His tail dropped low, wagging. He let out a small huff and stepped forward, toward her. Lily dropped to her knees. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'm here." Shadow walked slowly, deliberately, and pressed his head into her chest. Silence fell over the entire shelter. The volunteers, the staff, everyone stood frozen, watching the massive German shepherd melt into a child's embrace, as if nothing else in the world mattered. Rachel felt tears sting her eyes. This was the moment. He had been tested. Freedom, noise, fear, danger. He could have run. He could have lashed out. But instead, he chose her. He chose peace. Lily looked up at Rachel with a small smile. "He didn't run away. He came to find me." Rachel nodded slowly. "Yes, baby, he did." The staff moved in carefully, but there was no need. Shadow remained calm, obedient, even protective. He stood beside Lily, eyes watchful but peaceful, as if he knew finally where he belonged. They walked him back to Kennel 9 together, no leash needed. Rachel followed behind, heart full, throat tight. The ultimate test had come, and Shadow had passed, not by force, not by training, but by trust. The cage no longer held a threat, it held a choice, and the choice had been love. The shelter never felt the same after that day. Shadow had not just survived the storm, he'd risen above it. What began as an emergency had become a revelation. The very dog once labeled unfit for society had chosen protection over panic, compassion over instinct. And now, the entire facility saw him differently. Word of his transformation spread fast. News outlets picked up Rachel's video clip. Headlines appeared online. Aggressive ex-K9 saved by little girl's love. Reporters called, cameras came. But none of them truly captured what was happening. This wasn't a publicity stunt. It was a redemption story. Quiet, raw, and real. For Rachel, it wasn't about the headlines. It was about what she saw in Shadow's eyes every morning. A softness, a spark, a silent thank you each time Lily walked through the door. Even the board changed its tone. The inspector who once warned her about liability returned, this time with an open notebook and an apologetic smile. "I was wrong," he admitted. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." But Rachel knew better. She hadn't done this. Lily had. The final evaluation came 2 weeks later. A team of independent animal behaviorists observed Shadow over 3 days. They ran temperament tests, measured stress responses, tracked body language. In every scenario, Shadow remained calm, obedient, stable. When they asked Lily to enter the room during one of the tests, Shadow didn't bark, didn't lunge. He simply walked to her and lay down at her feet. "She's his anchor," one evaluator said. "It's extraordinary. the final report arrived in a sealed envelope. Shadow is cleared for supervised adoption. No further behavioral holds. Rachel held the paper in her hands like it was made of glass. The dog who once tore through muzzles and cowered in corners now had a future, and she knew exactly where that future belonged. "Lily," she said gently that night as they sat by the kennel together, "how would you feel if Shadow came home with us?" Lily gasped. "Forever?" Rachel nodded, tears already brimming. "Forever." The next morning, Shadow walked out of the shelter, not as a problem to be managed, but as a member of a family. No crate, no muzzle, just a blue collar with his name on it, and a little girl holding the leash. Neighbors stared, cameras clicked, but Shadow ignored it all. He only watched Lily. Their first night at home was quiet. Rachel set up a bed for him near Lily's room, but Shadow didn't stay there long. He waited until the house was dark, then padded softly into her room, curled beside her bed, and didn't move until morning. It became a ritual. Where Lily went, Shadow followed. They walked to school together, played in the yard, even shared snacks on the living room floor. He never snapped, never growled, only watched with gentle eyes and a tail that wagged at the sound of her laughter. Within a month, Rachel enrolled him in a therapy dog training program, not for obedience, but for connection. And he passed with flying colors. Shadow was no longer a weapon. He was a healer. Soon he began visiting local children's hospitals, sitting patiently beside wheelchairs, offering silent comfort to kids who couldn't speak. Nurses called him magic. Parents wept when their children smiled for the first time in weeks. Rachel watched it all unfold with quiet pride. He had gone from feared to beloved, from dangerous to needed. And in every life he touched, people saw not just a dog, but a reminder that even the most broken among us can still choose to love. Shadow had become more than a dog. He had become a symbol, a story, a savior. The house settled into a rhythm that felt almost magical. Morning sunlight filtered through lace curtains, warming the hardwood floors where Shadow lay stretched out peacefully. No tension in his body, no fear behind his eyes, just the quiet of belonging, something he had never truly known before. Lily woke each day with a mission: feed Shadow, brush him, then tell him a story. Sometimes it was a fairy tale, sometimes a dream she'd had. Shadow listened to all of it, tail gently wagging, eyes focused. He didn't understand every word, but he understood her voice. That was enough. Rachel watched from the kitchen, coffee in hand, heart full. For months she'd worried Shadow would never feel safe, that some part of his trauma would always stay just beneath the surface. But now, he was more than calm, he was joyful. And it was written in the way he trotted after Lily down the hall or sat patiently at the window, waiting for her to return from school. He began adjusting to domestic life faster than anyone expected. Car rides no longer made him freeze. Doorbells no longer triggered defense mode. The sound of the vacuum, once terrifying, now just made him scoot a few feet over with a quiet sigh. Lily took it upon herself to train him in new tricks, not out of discipline, but out of fun. "Paw," she'd say, and Shadow would place his large, gentle paw into her tiny hand. Spin, and he'd do a slow, awkward turn that always ended in giggles. Hug, and he'd lean against her chest, closing his eyes. They were inseparable. Rachel finally stopped worrying about leaving them alone in a room. Not because she trusted Shadow's training, but because she trusted his heart. He had proven, again and again, that Lily wasn't just his friend, she was his purpose. The neighborhood took notice too. Shadow became a local legend. Kids on bikes would wave and shout his name. Older neighbors, once wary, would nod with smiles when they saw him pass. Even the postman brought dog biscuits, slipping them through the gate with a grin. Still, there were reminders of who he used to be, fleeting shadows in his posture when strangers got too close too quickly. But he never lashed out. He'd simply take a step closer to Lily, like she was his grounding force. Then came the invitation from the local community center. Would Shadow visit during story hour? Rachel hesitated. Crowds, children, noise. But Lily jumped with excitement. "He'll love it! I'll read the books!" So they tried. That Saturday, Shadow entered the community library beside Lily, tail low but wagging. He lay on a soft mat while children sat in a circle around him. giggling and reaching out. Lily stood proudly at the front, picture book in hand, reading aloud, while Shadow lay still, ears flicking, eyes calm. He didn't flinch. He didn't growl. He just listened. By the time Lily finished the story, half the children were lying against Shadow's thick fur, fingers tangled in his coat, faces glowing. Parents cried softly at the sight. Some knew his story, others didn't. But they all felt the peace in that room. Later that night, Rachel tucked Lily into bed. "Do you think Shadow knows he's home?" Lily asked, eyes heavy with sleep. Rachel glanced at the dog curled at her daughter's feet, one paw draped protectively over her leg. His breathing was steady, peaceful. "I think," Rachel whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Lily's forehead, "he's always known. He was just waiting for someone to bring him here." Shadow opened one eye at the sound of her voice, then closed it again. Safe. Finally home. The seasons changed slowly around them. Spring melted into summer, and with it, the last traces of who Shadow used to be began to fade. The dog who once cowered in corners and growled at every hand now chased butterflies in the backyard and dozed under the sun with a lazy sigh. His story, once whispered in fear, was now spoken with pride. Lily kept a scrapbook filled with photos and drawings. Page after page showed their journey, from the first day outside Kennel 9 to trips to the park, from their first bedtime cuddle to hospital visits where Shadow lay beside children, too tired to speak. She titled it simply, "My Best Friend." Rachel submitted Shadow's story to a national animal rehabilitation program, not for attention, but in hopes of inspiring shelters to give other untouchables a second chance. A month later, they received a call. Shadow had been named the program's Canine Redemption Hero of the Year. They were invited to speak at the annual gala. Rachel was nervous, unsure of what to say. But when the moment came, she stepped onto the stage with Lily holding her hand and Shadow walking calmly beside them. A spotlight bathed the trio in soft light as the audience stood in silence. Rachel took a deep breath. "This is Shadow," she said. "He came to us broken, violent, and afraid. No trainer could reach him, no command could control him." And then, a little girl sat in front of his cage and simply said, "You look sad." The crowd hung on her every word. She didn't train him, she didn't fix him, she just saw him. And somehow, that was all he needed. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Afterward, dozens of people came forward, veterinarians, shelter directors, former soldiers who once worked with K9s, all wanting to meet the dog who had found peace through a child's love. Shadow didn't flinch once. He let strangers pet him. He wagged his tail gently. And when Lily sat down beside him, he placed his head on her knee like he always had. That night, as they drove home in silence, Lily looked out the window and whispered, "He's not just my dog. He's everyone's hope now." Rachel smiled. "Yes, sweetheart, he is." Back at home, the house was quiet. Moonlight spilled across the living room floor as Shadow curled into his favorite corner. Lily climbed onto the couch, her eyes already drifting closed. Rachel covered her with a blanket, then sat beside her, running a hand through her hair. She glanced at Shadow. "Thank you," she whispered. As if he understood, he let out a soft, content huff and closed his eyes. The story of Shadow and Lily wasn't one of dramatic rescues or grand gestures. It was made of quieter things, shared silence, soft touch, patient trust. It was the kind of story that reminds people that healing doesn't always look like progress charts or behavior graphs. Sometimes healing looks like a child sitting beside a cage with a crayon and a kind heart. They had saved each other, and in doing so, they'd shown the world what was possible. A girl too small to reach a kennel lock had unlocked a soul no one else dared approach. A dog deemed unlovable had become the most loving of them all, and somewhere in between those simple moments, between drawings slipped under kennel bars and quiet bedtime sighs, a miracle had happened. Not the kind you see in movies, the real kind, the kind that walks on four legs and wags its tail every time a little girl smiles.